my screen.
Okay.
All right, so hold on one second. All right, so what we'll do, and I'll just show you where I go as a quick reference each time, because I always, all right, you guys can see my MLS screen right now. That's what you see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I always just go to the SC Realtors forms, screaltors.org/forms. You can obviously get all these through your DocuSign account as well. They'll all be in there. And then I will pull up here. You do need your NRDS account or your NRDS number to get into this one. However, this is just where I happen to go for these classes because it seems to be the quickest one or the easiest to access, as I say, as it spins here with not much success. All right, while it's doing that, I'll close some of these out, see if we can get rid of some of the bandwidth at least. Make sure I'm connected to the right one. Okay. All right, so our fun form 310 is what we're going to go through today. Residential agreement to buy and sell. And like I said, we're going to stick specifically on the inspection paragraph. So can you guys, let me zoom in just a little bit. You guys see that okay? And read that okay? Okay. And you can also, obviously, if you have it in front of you, you can do that. So we're going to jump down to paragraph or section, I should say 8, which is on page 3. And we're going to talk mainly on, we're going to go through the repair process when you go under contract on a home. So there's basically, you have 3 different options to go through when you're a buyer purchasing a home on how you want to handle repairs. You have the repair procedure, which is the first option that's on the contract. You then have due diligence, which is right underneath that on the bottom of page 3. And then you have what is called as is, which is about halfway down page 4, very short paragraph. In a nutshell, they go in order of complication, starting with the most complicated at first, and then ending with the most clean cut last. As is, for the most part, this isn't a formal company policy, but for the most part, as is one of the least desirables or least recommended ways to go on a contract. Even as a seller, a lot of people say this is the best thing for a seller. I would agree, assuming that the buyer completely understands what is meant by as is. My challenge is I do think a lot of times the buyer doesn't really understand what that means. They think as is means I'm going to get the home inspected, but I'm not going to ask for any repairs. As is means they're buying the house, right? I mean, how this paragraph is written basically says it's sold strictly as is. As is means the buyer buys the property for the purchase price, while the seller maintains the property from the effective date through closing, subject to normal wear without repair or replacement. Sells the property for the purchase price. Buyer retains the right to inspect the property by 6 p.m. on blank date for informational purposes only. Last line, the seller is under no obligation to remedy any issues the buyer discovers during the inspections, and the buyer may not terminate the contract based on the results of any inspections conducted. Okay, so that, I mean, that is pretty cut and dry. You purchase this property, you go out there, the property is sitting right next to a landfill, behind a nuclear power plant, above a sinkhole, with a meth house next door. It does not matter. They're buying it. So that's just something you need to explain. Now, the other issue, yeah, Nancy?
If the mortgage company, I assume if there's a mortgage contingency and the mortgage company refuses to give them a mortgage based on the fact that the roof is caving in, that would be under the mortgage contingency, therefore not under the inspection contingency?
Correct, which is one of the many conflicting examples of this paragraph. Because if this is great, cut and dry. So let's say the seller accepts that, right? And they're thinking exactly what I just described, but the buyer goes in and says, well, I said as is, but I've got an FHA loan or a VA or whatever it may be. then that could be a potential of conflict. Now, what would win in that in court? More than likely, the financing contingency. However, the whole premise that I have on as it relates to writing contracts, the whole premise is not to win in court or to win the earnest money. It's to close the transaction with both sides being happy. So that's an excellent point. So if you bring that in, and then they have that contingency, the other one that proves to be difficult is the CL 100. Right, the CL 100 paragraph is a conflicting paragraph with this because the CL 100 says that the contract is contingent on the CL 100. So I don't know. I mean, I get why they put it in here. I don't know why they put it in here though. It just adds. It can create some issues. Okay. Now, if it's a situation where the buyer's going in and they know it's a good buy, they're going in at a price where they don't care what's wrong with it and they want to win, it's multiple offer. As long as you've advised your buyer on all the risks that they have, if they still want to do it, you can. You just need to make sure that you are very clear to them that they are not getting out of the contract. And if it comes down, if they ask questions like, well, what if the buyer, what if the seller didn't disclose this? Well, okay, then it's time to bring an attorney in, which is not the answer to everything, but is the answer to everything. We don't want it to be the answer to everything. All right. So yeah, that's as is in a nutshell. So let's jump back to I'm just going to work up the page because they go in order of easiest to explain. So the next one is going to be due diligence. Due diligence was brought in a few years ago. Due diligence, basically, just to give you a little history of South Carolina contracts, due diligence was brought in because for the longest time, buyer's agents, savvy buyer's agents, were putting verbiage in their offers that said this contract's contingent on what we called sole satisfaction surveys. Contracts contingent on the buyer's sole satisfaction of any and all inspections. And in the event they don't like the inspection, they can get out. So finally, the the South Carolina Association of Realtors looked at this and said, let's go ahead and just put that in there. Most states have what's called due diligence. So what due diligence says is you have a due diligence period that begins on an effective date, which is the date that the contract is signed, and expires at 6 p.m. on whatever date is filled in here at the bottom of page 3. That's the only date you need to know in due diligence. Nothing matters after that, to be honest with you. Now, I'll go back. We will review a repair addendum after I go through these. But I don't want to bring it in now because it confuses it. So what happens during the due diligence period is mapped out pretty clearly on the next page. The buyer may take timely, prudent steps to help buyer, inspectors, seller, estimators, realtors, anything for the buyer to coordinate inspections and request repairs. Also gives time for seller to obtain repair estimates, buyer and seller to negotiate repairs, and buyer to potentially timely, properly due diligence, terminate, or buy. Right, so that next paragraph basically says all of this has to happen by the date above. So when you're setting that date, you want to take all of those things into consideration. Are you giving the buyer enough time to have their inspections? Are you giving the buyer is the buyer giving themselves enough time to then review the inspection report and find out what's really important and what's not? Then are you giving the seller enough time to then go get estimates and evaluate how much, if anything, they are going to do of your inspection request, to then get back to you with an answer that then you have to then take as a buyer, take time to process and see if you want to move forward or terminate or renegotiate. Right. Next paragraph says, during the due diligence period, seller agrees buyer may rely on the following list of 5 items in accordance with the contract and laws. Buyer is solely responsible for inspections. Okay. Now, when it says buyer is solely responsible for inspections, that means don't have as part of your repair request to say seller to have HVAC evaluated. That's an inspection. That's what the buyer should do. Buyer is not required to inspect, so they don't have to inspect it. Until the buyer timely or properly terminates the contract or the parties agree on an amended contract, the buyer can rely on number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5 of below. This right here was put into place because of an old contract, but basically it says when you deliver, if you're the buyer under due diligence, when you deliver your repair request, that does not extend the due diligence period. So your date up above here is not your due date to get repair requests in. It is your date to have either agreed upon moving forward or to have timely terminated. So going back down, the 5 things that's going to happen during due diligence is they're going to conduct the inspection, should they choose to do so. They're going to deliver repair requests, should they do so. They're going to proceed under the amended contract if they want. They can proceed under the as-is contract, meaning that they're going to buy it anyway, and they're not going to get repairs, or they can terminate the contract by delivering a notice of termination and termination fee to the seller within the due diligence period. All right, we'll start with Daniel, and then we'll go to Nancy.
So if there's not anything obvious about particular property, is there a recommended due diligence time period? Is it 30 days or?
I think you'll be hard pressed to get much more than 15 days on a residential contract. 2 weeks is normally about that.
Okay.
Yep.
So
Nancy. Oh, sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, so 15 days would be the recommended due diligence period. And when would you maybe change that? What would you be looking for?
I don't know that I would. I mean, and that's why you also want to get the inspector out there quickly, because the inspector then may come up for something and say, yeah, we might want to get an HVAC guy out here or somebody else out here, and then you may need to extend the due diligence period at that point.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm sorry to keep asking questions. I'm coming from Pennsylvania and we're very
Yeah.
different here.
First of all, don't apologize for asking questions. That's why we're having this. So ask away.
All right. I kind of like this better, but my question is here, what we do is we do the inspections. We have, a certain period of time. It goes to the seller responds. We go back to whether we agree or not. So if 15 days often isn't a lot of time to get the inspection, get it to them, get them to get a price with contractors the way they are these days.
Mm-hmm.
Is it more preferential to say, we just want this done and then put it on them to get prices and say yes or no and hopefully say yes, and then they have to extend the period, or how does that work?
Who is them and they in that scenario?
If I'm representing the buyer, let's
Okay.
say if I'm representing the buyer and we do our inspections and there are some issues and we go back to them and say, we want this repaired.
Yeah. So in any situation, and this is my preference. This isn't a hard and fast rule because it ultimately comes down to the client. In any situation, if the buyer can have it done themselves, I would prefer the buyer have it done themselves. So to your question, I would prefer the buyer to say, hey, here's what we want done. We've gotten a quote. Here's what's going to cost. Instead of you fixing it, give us a credit.
But in that case, that's the problem, is that you need to get the estimate, and with contractors, It's not necessarily easy. So the 15 days, if you get an inspector out within 7 days, trying to get a contractor and everything written up and getting contractors to give you estimates, it gets a little hairy there, doesn't it?
It could, and you could have to ask for an extension. I would tell you that in this market, getting a seller to accept due diligence at all is going to be tough. Getting them to accept due diligence more than 15 days is going to be super tough.
I understand. I'm thinking.
Yeah. So that would be part of your due diligence as the agent, is to say, hey, if you've got a contractor that you know that you want to do the quoting of this, let's go ahead and see if we can tentatively get them on the calendar, as well as the inspector, find out what their time frame is. Because if both of them say, hey, my time frame is 2 weeks, well, then at that point you say, hey, the reason I put due diligence at this is because we've already got the contractor. What I see happen that's very effective, and I don't see it a lot, is a lot of times an agent, you'll have 2 or 3 inspectors that you have, and you go to them and say, hey, what are the days that all of you have available? What's your first available? And then the one that can do it soonest, go ahead and tentatively schedule them. So when you submit the offer, you can say, hey, we've already got the contractor or the inspection scheduled tentatively. So that's why we're confident in these days. So good question. All right. Anything else? Any other questions? All right. So we go down to the next part of due diligence, the termination fee. During the due diligence, the buyer may unilaterally terminate, which means they can terminate by basically sending a notice of termination at any time and they're out. Doesn't have to be agreed upon, anything like that. It's specifically a unilateral termination or notice, which means a notice sent to the agent at their email listed on the last page of the contract. Which is why it's important you make sure you have the most accurate email on there, because you have to send it to the one that the contract states. And they can do that by delivering the seller both notice of termination and a termination fee of X. Now, technically how this is written is not how a lot of people do it. What a lot of people will do is they'll say, hey, if they have a termination fee in here, which we're starting to see more and more of, and the question always is what should that be? The question always is, from the buyer's standpoint, as little as possible, and from the seller's standpoint, as much as possible. Now, I think a fair assessment in this market, if you're going to be competitive, is to be at a minimum covering the time period of what it would be for rent or to carry that property during the due diligence period. So if you had a 2-week due diligence period and you're in a market that's roughly, during that time would be, a month's rent would be $2,000 or something like that, or carrying costs would be $2,000, then you would say termination fee of $1,000. I think that's where essentially people are kind of landing. Again, I know most buyers agents, unless they just are trying to be super, super competitive, are not going to put a lot in there because obviously they don't want their buyer's exposure to be any more than it needs to be. Now, if you do have a fee in here where it's going to before is when you send that notice of termination, you technically send the notice of termination, which is a form within itself. I'll make sure I make a list of the forms that we will need to go see at the end of this. The notice of termination itself, which then would be accompanied by a check written for this amount. Now, what happens is you normally do a notice of termination, or you just send a release and you have the earnest money split. $1,500 goes to the seller, back to the buyer, and then $500 goes to the seller as this termination fee. Doesn't really matter. It gets you the same thing. Yes.
So what you're saying is you don't have to write a check. They just split that the $1,000.
How this is written, it says you should be writing a check. How it's normally happening though is they're splitting the earnest money. Whoever's holding the earnest money is cutting $1,500 back to the buyer. It's 6 to 1, half dozen the other. Yep. Now, this next part, and this is an important part, the last part of it says, during the due diligence period, should the buyer fail to obtain a new amended contract or fail to timely, properly due diligence terminate the contract, the buyer agrees to buy and the seller agrees to sell the property as is. And then it describes as is again, which basically means the purchase price and the same condition that it was when you went under contract. It's important to notice this because if you're coming up to your deadline, and let's just say the date above was this afternoon at 6 or today at 6, and right now we're waiting to hear back from a final answer on a seller. If the seller does not answer at 6:01, your buyer's buying that house as is. And I don't care if the buyer, and we've had this where we've said, the seller's agent has said, look, they're agreeing to it. They just can't get it signed by them. That's fantastic. If we don't have it signed at 5:59, I'm sending the notice of termination. This isn't a threat. This isn't anything. Your sellers can always come back and put us under contract. But if you just let it lapse with nothing in writing, and then let's say the buyer, the seller says, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And then they talk to somebody who says, by the way, you didn't have that in writing and it's expired now. You don't have to do it. You're just going to have a situation on your hands. So it's just super important that if, because people call, I get calls all the time. And obviously I'm not trying to deter calls, please call me, but I get calls all the time the day of due diligence. And they're like, well, what do we do if we don't hear from them? Well, you need to advise your client that at 6 o'clock, if we don't have an answer, you're buying the house as is. So if you're not comfortable with that, I recommend that we draw up a termination agreement, have it signed and ready to go, and just let them know to say, and I'll let the listing agent know to say, hey, buyers are super nervous about being locked in as is. So we've drawn up a termination agreement to deliver should we not hear back from you. I'm not saying this to be threatening. I'm not saying this to be bullying or anything like that. It is my job to protect my buyer, though, to not be stuck in an as-is contract. This has nothing to do with you, Mr. Seller, Mr. Listing Agent. It's not that I don't trust you. It's not that I don't trust. We just recently had this actually with my wife, Lynn. The listing agents, the seller was in the hospital and was sick, and they were like, couldn't get down there to do it. And they were like, we completely get it. We understand. And this is not anything against them. However, them being sick doesn't protect my client. Miraculously, they were able to sign it prior to 6 p.m. So, Celeste, yes.
So with that, and if you have someone that can't get to their computer by 6 p.m., if there is some other form of written communication, kind of relaying that and the parties agree, like, between the agents, is that good? Like, hey, my folks just can't get it. No. Okay.
It has to be. I mean, the statute of limitations or the statute of frauds in South Carolina says anything real estate related has to be in writing.
But I mean, if it is
signed off in writing.
Oh, signed off. Okay.
Yeah, signed off in writing.
Okay.
And in writing would mean that has been signed off by them. It would be a strong argument. Unfortunately, we finally got put that whole in writing into a test in a lawsuit about 6 months ago, where a missing initial made the contract voidable enough where there was, the buyer did not have to forfeit the earnest money because there was a missing initial on there, and it basically voided the entire contract. Even the buyer completely defaulted on the contract had they initialed. Wow. So I just say that, and again, none of this matters unless something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, in those situations where the seller's in the hospital, the chances of that happening of turning out bad are slim to none until something goes wrong. Right. And then all of a sudden it's, the stuff hits the fan, and then they go to sue, and it's like, well, actually you never really agreed to this in time, so it's technically be voidable. So that's why you want to do that. But to your specific question, no, it doesn't. And everybody always asks, well, we'll just get an extension. Well, they have to sign off on an extension. So if they can sign off on an extension, they can sign off on whether or not they agree on that. Nancy, go ahead.
So are you saying that if the buyer's agent sends a termination to the listing agent saying, if we don't hear back from you by 6 o'clock, we are out, it has to be signed by the sellers as well? Or is that enough of notice saying?
No, it's a unilateral. So what's highlighted on the screen, it's a unilateral termination. So if you send the notice of termination signed by the buyer, you're fine. That's you've performed on the contract. Yep. All right. Any other questions on due diligence? Because we're about to move into the bane of my existence, which is the repair procedure. All right, so here we go. Let's jump into repair procedure. The one that we are seeing the most of now, because it's the one that protects the seller the most, is what we call repair procedures. The first option under this. I say it's the bane of my existence. It actually it's a fairly simple process. There is a lot of talk about changing it, but here's what we have to deal with now. Repair procedure, in a nutshell, are pre-agreed upon repairs. That's how I explain it to your buyer. That's how I explain it to your seller. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if they come in and they're offering a repair procedure, basically they're saying we're going to get the home inspected, but there's only an expectation that you're going to do the following repairs. And I'll read to you how that's pointed out. So in repair procedure, all repair procedure inspections and requests shall be completed and delivered to the seller by no later than 6 p.m. on blank date. Okay, so this starts your first date of repair procedure. I think it's realistic to have this done in 7 to 10 days. That all depends on the timing of your inspector, though. If your inspector can't get out for 7 days, that's not, to Nancy's point, that's not going to give enough time for the buyer to take a look at it and say, hey, let me just take a look to see if I even want to ask for any of these or anything like that. So again, it all comes down to a communication, right? So you're going to set a date here that gives you enough time to get the inspections and then submit repair requests. That's it. This doesn't take into consideration the seller's response or anything like that. This first date is simply for the buyer's performance on the repair procedure. Okay. Jumps onto the next sentence. It says, any and all requests necessary to place the heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water supply systems, water waste systems to be conveyed in operative condition, to make the roof free of leaks, to address environmental concerns, and to make improvement structurally sound, should be delivered by the date above. So basically what that is saying is you have until the date above to do your repairs, to do your inspections, and then find out what repairs need to be addressed that fall under these categories only, right? So if the heating and air conditioning systems, which does include the fireplace, does as in yes, includes the fireplace. If the heating, electricity, plumbing, water supply, water waste are all in operable condition. The roof is not leaking. The roof can be 130 years old if it is not leaking. If there are no environmental concerns and there are no structural concerns, the seller, per this part of the contract, has absolutely no obligation to lift a finger to change the condition of the home. And that, quite honestly, is how you should explain it to your buyer, right? I mean, you can go out there, the HVAC system can be 132 years old. The roof, the whole house can be original house built in 1892. If all of this is working, the seller is not obligated to do anything. Okay. Now, if the buyer fails to notify the seller within this time frame, the buyer has waived any and all rights under this section. Okay, that's probably not going to happen, unless you get an inspection report that says, "Hey, there's nothing's coming up under all of these." If lender's commitment, this goes to Nancy's situation before, if lender's commitment requires any additional inspection or certification, these are to be provided by the buyer. Technically should be provided during the same time. However, it doesn't state that in there. It's a part of this that's a little bit of an error. Buyer at buyer's expense will have the privilege and responsibility of inspecting the structure. This kind of repeats it. The structure, square footage, environmental concerns, including not limited to mold, radon gas, lead-based paint hazards, including lead-based paints, wetland study, appurtenant buildings, heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water supply systems, waterway system, as well as appurtenant equipment and appliances. So basically it's saying they have the privilege and right to inspect for all of these. It's basically kind of puts the cart after the horse, unlike in the last one. Upon seller's request, the buyer will provide a copy of the inspection report. Very important word in this last sentence. Will. So if the seller requests, per the contract, the buyer's agreed, they will provide it. You need to make sure if that happens and your buyer starts to push back, you have to unfortunately say, unfortunately, Mr. Buyer, I didn't point this out to you in the contract, but you actually do have to share your inspection report with the seller. All right, with me so far? All right, let me make sure. Bring it back up. See everybody's smiling face. Hey, everyone. I don't see Christy and I don't see iPhone, but that's okay. I like seeing everybody else. All right, now let's jump into the response time. So you've had it inspected. You've submitted your repairs. It does not matter when you submit these repairs, right? These repairs can be submitted anytime prior to this date, or your requests, I should say. The seller then has no later than this date to deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs to the buyer's repair request. So really quickly, if you're a buyer's agent and you're writing this contract, I think the time frame between these two dates should be maybe somewhere around the terms of 5 days. Because if you're submitting a repair request to a seller and the seller has to go get quotes and do research, you need to give them time to go do so. 5 days is probably the longest, right? But you need to give them time to do so. A lot of buyers, agents may want, or buyers would want it sooner. I don't know why, right? I think you don't want to rush the seller to make decisions on this, particularly in this market. This then repeats from above the costs of all repairs to heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water waste, and making sure these systems are operable, make roof-free of leaks, environmental concerns, and structurally sound shall be paid by the seller. Seller paid repairs. Seller paid requests do not include home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, energy efficiency. The seller contractually agrees to make all the requested seller paid repairs. The parties agree to proceed under the contract. The repairs to any items, the repairs to any other items are sole responsibility of the buyer. Okay, so the seller has until this time to submit or to respond, basically, to the repairs. Now, here's where it gets a little gray. Is this last part is what happens if the seller does not timely respond per above. Now, I read this as if seller does not timely respond per above, meaning per above to this date. There is an argument in the marketplace now that if seller does not timely respond per the above or does not agree to make all the deadline repairs, the buyer shall within 2 calendar days. The question is 2 calendar days from when? I say it's this blank right here. There are parts of the marketplace that say 2 calendar days from when this date up here, or excuse me, from when they submit their requests. The reason I don't agree with that is because if they submit let's say let's just for fun, this is the 20th and this is the 25th. Well, let's say they submit this on the 18th. Well, they've got till the 25th to respond on here. So this 2 days can't mean from when it's submitted. It's got to mean from this date here. Now, don't die on the hill of who's right based on this 2 days. This would be a good time to start the communication if you think it's going to take a while for your seller to respond, right? So you want to make sure that you're just saying, hey, if we don't respond during this time, here's why. And the 2 days is a conflict possibly, so we need to make sure you know. So what happens in that 2 days, if the buyer can choose any one of the following: accept the property in the present condition, negotiate a new amended contract, which clearly it's kind of hard to say they did, or they're going to because they haven't heard back yet, or terminate this contract by delivering notice, which means they can then submit basically notice of termination at that point because the seller hasn't agreed to do so. The buyer fails to accept or any one of those, and the buyer agrees and the seller agrees to purchase the property as is. And it goes on to the as is at that point. All right. Yes, Nancy, go ahead. This is where all the questions come in.
Okay, so since I bought my house there and it was different for me, so therefore you are not allowed to ask for anything other than if the roof is leaking. If there are issues with the roof, if there are shingles missing, if anything, you can't ask for anything other than those specific things.
You can. The seller is not obligated to do anything, though. You can always ask for it. And by the way, as part of your listing presentation, you want to say, or part of your consultation, I should say, when you accept these offers, is you'll want to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this is all you're obligated to ask or to do. I can't promise you they won't ask for the moon. Actually, they more than likely will. So just prepare yourself for that. And it's not like they're trying to do anything tricky or sneak anything by you. They are just trying to make sure that they could get as much as they want or as much as they can. So yeah, you can ask for it. They're just not obligated to do it. All right. Anybody else? Other questions on that? Go ahead, Celeste.
Just because someone has a buyer puts a request into a seller to service the HVAC or do something of that nature, the seller doesn't have to do that because it's HVAC. It's one of those 9 things, right? They can still say no, like we don't want to do it.
Yeah, so that's a common one that comes up, and there's 2 different schools of thought on this. One is if I don't know, I've never understood this, and my wife says I get too black and white on it, which is ironic if you know our relationship. But it's, if someone comes in and says, hey, seller to have, based on, because what it'll say is the 2 areas that it comes up on, the HVAC and the electrical system. And it'll say, the inspection report will say, HVAC is at the end of its life, recommend a licensed HVAC technician evaluate. Well, that's your obligation as the buyer. So if you come to me with a request that says, hey, go get it surveyed or evaluated, I'm going to say as the seller, no. The only thing I have to do is make sure it's in operable condition. And what you've shown me is it's in operable condition. If you want to have it go have it inspected, welcome to do so, but it's not something the seller's obligated to do. Okay. What else? What other questions do you have? I'm pulling up a couple more docs where you guys are asking questions. Anybody? Yes, go ahead, Deb.
It's just curious in seeing all the transactions, you know, like I work with Karen, and so she has a lot of different things that come through all the time. Is you do see lots of cases where the seller does do things that are not on that list, you know,
Yeah.
like they didn't disclose there was a spot on the hardwood floor that was covered by a rug. You know, it happened recently that it was discovered when Karen's buyers moved in, there was this big spot that they didn't know about.
Mhm.
And they actually have the closing attorney hold money in escrow
Mhm.
for the repair. I mean, but technically flooring is cosmetic. I mean, according to the contract, but they still did it.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they can't, and it's a good point to bring up, because at the end of the day, you've got to understand there are a lot of sellers out there that have a very admirable pride of ownership, right? And that's not to say if a seller chose not to do it that there's that's not a knock on their character. A lot of people are very black and white on the contract. You know, in that case, that seller probably was like, you know what, that wasn't right. I didn't know about it, and I'm not gonna. You know, I'm going to help them get that to where it should be. And they absolutely can. And that's what I always
Sure.
tell a seller. And you know, sometimes it comes across as not, you know, going to bat for your seller, which I think you should, right? I think you should. And you can also paint the whole picture to your seller. You can say, Mr. Seller, listen, this is not covered. However, an electrician will charge $100 to replace all the GFCI outlets in there, and done. We don't have to argue a gray area. He's already coming out to do this one thing. Like, you know, do it. Right? You have so much bandwidth that comes from that, from a negotiation standpoint. You know, in that case, it was. I would probably have in that one if it was because I would imagine that was fairly expensive.
It was.
You know, in that case, there would have been. We had that once where the exact same thing. The difference is underneath the carpet were a lot of pet stains that had been covered up. Now, one would argue if you truly were inspecting your property in the condition of hardwood floors, why would you have not lifted up the rug? That's easy for me to say in this beautiful bubble that we have of the seven of us right here, because it's like when I represented buyers, I don't know that I ever told an inspector to make sure he looks under the rug. Right. So
Yeah, I've never seen one do that.
Yeah. Nancy, go ahead.
I have just a story. I've done real estate a long time. I sold real estate in Alaska. I sold a house in Alaska. When we did the final walkthrough, the sofa had been moved, and behind the wall were like gaping holes, and the electric outlet was out of the wall with wires. Inspectors can't move furniture. They can't adhere, as my experience everywhere I've been. Inspectors aren't allowed to move car area rugs, move furniture to check behind. But if a seller knows that it's there and they've lied on the seller's disclosure and say that there are no damage to the floors, there is no damage to the walls, and they say that, it's a legal issue. But it basically is who's got the stronger hand. Right now, it's the seller's market. Buyers will take anything no matter what. In a buyer's market, if it's been sitting on the market for 6 months and the seller wants to sell it, they'll do what needs to be done.
Right. Very true.
And we as an agent move furniture and look at
I wouldn't advise it. I mean, you could, but if
it's not advised, then I won't do it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to do that. You know, we had one time where it was a similar situation. You know, they moved out and the seller had totally forgotten that they had covered up. They had done work to the shower in the master a couple years before. And because of where the work was done, they just forgot to finish the drywall because it was behind a huge dresser. And they had told me, they were like, hey, we're going to have that painted. But the buyers got out there for their final walkthrough before we told them, and they flipped out. They were like, what else are they hiding? I'm like, well, first of all, they're not. They've already said they're going to repair it. Right. So don't freak out. So Daniel, go ahead.
Okay, I'm a little embarrassed because everyone else seems experienced and I'm brand new here getting ready to prepare my first listing for.
Everyone started as brand new, Daniel. There's no reason to be embarrassed.
All right. Well, anyway, on this listing, I'm preparing right now for the market. There's a question about the water heater, just because two things of it. One of, they got some kind of inspection from there. I don't know if it's from HOA or somewhere, where they were told that the water heater wasn't supported properly because it's in the garage, kind of up on a platform. So that seems like something they would need to fix. But then on the other side, they're sitting there going back and forth well, should we replace this water heater because it looks a little rusty, but there's nothing wrong with it, it's working. You know, they're looking for my recommendation. Do I even recommend on things like that, or I just say?
I would, if it's
Dash forward.
functional, the chances for them right now is if because it's functional, if you get a repair procedure contract, you're not going to have to do anything to it. Even the support, unless it's a structural issue. But if it's a now like the seismic straps or something like that, which is now a coded issue but wasn't before, that specifically stated it's not covered. I would recommend in that case that you don't do it and have them put a home warranty on the house to cover it during the listing and offer that home warranty as part of the buyer's incentive. Because if anything goes wrong during the listing period with the hot water heater, it'll be covered. And the buyer in that price point is more than likely going to ask for a home warranty anyway. So go ahead and have one on there and you'll be good to go.
Okay.
All right, so let's jump into a couple quick documents on this, and we can obviously still ask questions. We want to make sure I cover them. So I'm going to jump back onto the screen share. So the first one is the repair procedure. I'm not going to go line by line on this. Well, yeah, I'll go pretty thorough on this. So basically, this is repair addendum. This honestly was originally designed for due diligence. It was not designed for repair procedure. Repair procedure basically is I'm either going to do what's required or I'm not. However, everyone uses this for all of them, and I'm really, that's fine. Whatever, you can do that. A couple things it does. So basically, it says what the repairs mean. So this is one that often comes across as we miss it. Where it basically says parties agree the seller's expense. Seller agrees to cause complete in good faith and timely manner the addendum's written actions to the property. Basically, going to do these repairs. Parties agree that their intent of the contract is that the seller will always hire qualified workers, licensed, bonded, insured contractors, electricians, plumbers, yada, 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 for all repairs except the most basic of repairs, meaning the seller could be qualified to adequately paint a portion of the property or remove dead tree or other basic repairs. And technically, I think this line is here to put what those are. But if you don't put what those basic repairs are, then you're leaving it up for interpretation. Then you're going to have related documents attached. They either are or are not. When you're submitting a repair request, it is my recommendation that you always attach the inspection report to it. That gives you clarification. Most contractors, if they're getting quotes, if you send them the inspection report, it will allow them to reference that and be able to adequately answer the question. Parties agree the seller complete the repairs no later than blank calendar days prior to closing. Here's what I don't like about this is now an opportunity for this to change the contract. Original contract says everything's to be done by closing, and that the buyers have the right and privilege to walk through the property within 48 hours of closing. So if you agree on repairs, but now you're telling the seller they need to have the repairs completed 5 calendar days prior to, now all of a sudden you're rushing the seller. So just make sure if you're representing the seller and you get this, that this is a realistic number for them to have completed, right? Because then it says, and then the buyer shall deliver repair cure notice to the seller of any repair inspections no later than blank calendar days prior to closing, which is actually going to be fewer than the one above, because they're saying, hey, they're going to need to be completed within 5 days. And then I'm going to give you as a buyer some notice that it needs to be done more properly within 4 days. And then you're just counting down. This paragraph right here is a colossal disaster in my opinion, but it is what it is. So we need to deal with it. And then they have to complete those, any sort of curing repairs no later than X calendar days here. Honestly, 532 is safe to put there. People always ask what should it be. Just do 532, 321, 321 if I'm the seller, because it gives me, longer to get things done. Says best practices are agreed upon the repairs that are right in the blanks below. The repairs, a specific reference to a repair recommendation, and to avoid vague repair requests vaguely references an attached document. If using repair procedure, notate that repair as seller paid repairs. Again, I don't think you need to notate seller paid repairs, because the only thing you're putting on here are repairs you're expecting the seller to make. Now, here's what I do want to point out. Please do not put see attached repair inspection or see attached summary with 23 things on there, 19 of which say recommend further evaluation. Two reasons I don't like that. Number one, it's vague. And number two, it's incredibly lazy from a buyer's agent standpoint, right? So what you want to put is on the list below, number one, the repair, right? Door jamb in master bedroom needs to be repaired. And then in parentheses, see section 1.2. Number two, leak in guest bathroom needs to be repaired. See section blank, right? So just put the list in here and then reference the attached one. I know there are some companies that will have, they send you these fancy lists that say, put this on your repair request. As long as it is a list that specifically says repair this, right? This evaluate and repair if needed. It's a little vague. You're leaving it up to the seller because he says if needed. From a seller standpoint, I'm like, great, because my contractor is going to say it ain't needed, right? So just be careful on that. And then if seller, this last part says if seller fails to complete repairs agreed upon in this repair agreement, the buyer shall accept the property in the present condition, negotiate, reach an agreement, different terms, or terminate this agreement. Again, it's not, this is kind of weird. It just goes and repeats what it says in the contract. The part that's causing the most two things that are causing the biggest bone of contention on three, whether or not a contractor needs to do it. So by the way, if you haven't put, if it's written in here, a lot of people are doing this, they're writing in the blank, all repairs to be done by a licensed contractor. If you don't strike that as a listing agent, you're obligating your seller to fix the GFCI outlets or change light bulbs and hire someone to do it. So just be careful on that. Number two, not listing them out, like I said. And then number three, starting to use this this expiration. If it is repair procedure, this paragraph right here is irrelevant. You can put whatever date you want in here. If I'm the listing agent, I don't care, right? Because it does not, you can't this is modifying the contract unilaterally, which you can't do. So a lot of times the buyer's agent will put, now if you want to put the same date that's referenced in the second date of the repair procedure, you can do that if you'd like. It's just repetitive.
So you can leave it blank?
You can leave it blank. You can leave it blank. All right, form 313 is your notice of termination. So this is what you would use to send the notice of termination. If it is involving the release of earnest money, then you would use form 518, which is the release of agreement to contract buy sell, but also talks about the disbursement of your earnest money down here. Technically, you should use both. 9 times out of 10, people just use 518. I'm not real attached to that. Now, understand if there's a conflict, and let's say your seller says, sure, I'll, or no, I'll let you out of the contract, but I'm fighting for damages. If your seller signs this or your buyer signs this, this is a full release from the contract, right? Which basically means that they can't go after anything else on this. So you just need to keep that in mind. A lot of times they'll say, fine, we'll sign the release, but I'm going to go after them for damages, but I need to get my home sold. Well, you can't do that if you sign this. Okay, so 525 is a repair procedure, 313 is the notice of termination, 518 is the release of agreement.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay, so once again, here we have, once you terminate, then the seller can, if the buyer terminates, then the seller can turn around and sell.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, so that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an area that people don't really agree with me on, which is fine. If I'm the listing agent and the buyer has sent me a termination or buyer sent me notice that they're not moving forward, my obligation is to get another contract on that house. So I'm going to put the house back on the market. And a lot of people say you can't do that without a release of the earnest money. I don't agree. Now, you need to explain to your sellers that there's a risk that you still have, they can come after you for earnest money. They can try to, but even if they go to small claims court or anything like that, that's against the person, not the property. Now, could they put a lien on the property? Sure, they could try to go pretty drastic on that. But you could put the house back on the market. Now, be prepared for the buyer's agent to not be happy about that. But that's, I just had this conversation with a Carolina One broker whose agent was upset, but the broker understood, it is what it is. I mean, it's fine. It does cause a lot of fun though. I get a lot of phone calls from that one.
But, and then the termination, the release of deposit, once again, that goes back to what you agree to pay as a termination fee.
If there's a termination fee, yes, you can do the disbursement of that in there. That typically doesn't happen in due diligence. The release without and then going back on the market typically happens with repair procedure. Yep. All right, questions about repairs? It's not too bad.
Do you attend a inspection at any given time on buyer or seller side?
Good question. So that is up to you. As the listing agent, I don't recommend it because it can just be awkward. Now, if your seller wants you there and you have to be there, I would say go and then bring your computer and sit out on the front porch and stay out of everybody's way. And not from the way of anything that you're not going to get in the way. You just don't want the buyer to be awkward and not be asking questions or anything like that with their inspector. From a buyer's agent standpoint, from a liability standpoint, it's not necessary. And quite frankly, is risky, in my opinion. There's an entire paragraph, actually. This is a good question, Celeste. I'm glad you brought this up. I don't have a very popular opinion on this one, to be honest with you.
Well, I've been such a ray of sunshine with all my repair procedure things.
Yeah. No, so if you look at the in here, and I show you this because I wanted to, there's a point of why I feel the way that I do. Let me find the paragraph really quickly. All right, so paragraph 26 in the contract. Paragraph 26 is a good paragraph for you to reference to your buyers to say, listen, I'm a real estate agent. I'm here to facilitate this transaction, but I don't give any warranties to things that relate to the condition of the property, the systems, condition of the property and the quality of the land, the offsite conditions, the schools, or anything like that. I'm here to facilitate the transactions. I'm going to help you do that. And what that looks like is I'm going to recommend highly qualified inspectors for you to hire. You can hire whomever you would like. Now, as far as the inspection is concerned, my normal plan is I get there, I meet the inspector, I let them in. You're welcome to be there from start to finish. It's 3 hours. It can be grueling, or you can meet the inspector at the end, which is what most inspectors prefer. And I too will come back at the end. And that to me is enough. I don't think you need to be there. However, if you want to be, sure. Right. This isn't the hill I'm going to die on. If you are there, where I think a lot of agents get in trouble is by being there, they try to be the bearer of all news. And that's where things get lost in translation. And I've seen more problems with agents being more involved with inspections than I have seen problems from agents not being that involved in inspections. Because then all of a sudden they became the relay of the news, and that's not good. They shouldn't be that. So, it's up to you. And quite honestly, I mean, there's been a couple seasons that Lynn's gone through when she's been super busy where she'll go for the end, but she'll get permission from the sellers to have, to get a contractor's code for the inspector to go. Now, if the seller doesn't allow that, then clearly you go. I mean, that's, there's exceptions to everything. So thoughts on that? Questions on that? Daniel?
No, mine's not exactly on that. I'll wait and see.
Okay. Anything on that? Deb, I feel like you have a question.
You can see my face.
I can.
Yeah, I just, I've been working with Karen for a very, very long time now, and she always wants one of us to be at their inspections. But I'm just thinking, I mean, it's a huge waste of time because you're sitting there for hours, for one thing. But I'm thinking about the liability side of it, because we do ask questions, and a lot of times we are relaying things that the inspector said to our buyers. And so I'm just thinking of it now in a totally different way based on what you said. And it's just got my wheels turning.
Yeah. Well, and don't misunderstand me on it. I think there is a liability, but I also think if you're smart about it, which I have no doubt that y'all are, it's most people that come towards the end, they come there to help kind of decipher some of the information, right? Not necessarily relay all of it, but they'll be there at the end to kind of help be a second set of eyes and ears with the inspector, especially if the buyer's been there the whole 3 hours, because they're just an overload, right? So I'm not saying it's not something that you shouldn't be there. So when they say, Deb, what about this, this HVAC thing? Like, I can't, blah, blah, blah. And then you can, since you were there, you can say things like, well, if you'll remember, they're saying because of its age, this could be a concern, but it's not necessarily something that's going to be yada, 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 or vice versa. Right. So I don't think it's a total abstinence of the inspection. But not trying, I'll never forget, I taught a class one time and we were talking about this as far as highest and best use of your time. And I had there was an agent in the class that said, well, if I need to be there because I need to be a second set of eyes in case the inspector misses something, that's not a good position to put yourself in. Because if you're selling yourself as that, by the way, as the agent, and the inspector does miss something, then the buyer's going to say, well, you were the second set of eyes that wasn't going to, that was going to make sure they didn't miss it. So again, it's overthinking it, admittedly, and it's also ultimately up to you. I know buyers agents that have been in the business, or agents that have been in the business for 20. Karen's one of them. I mean, people have been in the business for a long time, and that's part of what they do. They want to be there. It's part of their service, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's just to the question of Celeste is, do you have to be? It kind of comes down to being a little bit up to you.
Right.
Yep.
I just have to, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Now, if I get a message from Karen that says, Deb came back and said she didn't have to be any inspections.
No.
I know.
That's not going to happen.
All right. Any other questions? Daniel, what was your question?
Yeah, mine again is, as the new agent going to do my first listing, I don't want my lack of experience to stop me from being a complete expert. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of a packet that I missed, or a list or something of everything I need to worry about, or I can kind of study, or should I just download all the contracts and possible and go over them, or is there something that kind of spells out which contracts at which point are absolutely necessary, which are optional, or
so
things that tend to happen, and look out for this, look out for the timing on that, and this, that, and the other.
Yeah, so that's the reason that we do this as a series, and it's not like contracts for new agents, right? Because we have this conversation. We've taught, like Deb's been to this before, right? We've had this, and this is a new topic we brought up with the inspections. Karen is normally at these as well. So it's something that you come to. You'll never know all of it. I mean, this is why, honestly, I've made notes on a couple of things that, in reading through, I'm like, let me get some clarify. I've got the South Carolina legal hotline email. I mean, I don't even have to, I hit B, it's Byron King, bam, and it goes. So it's always questions. Now, to your specific question, I always say, go to get the list of the documents that are required for each, the required ones first, right? So if you go and you start an opportunity, there's only a handful for each one, right? The purchase and sale, all of those. Read through, fill it out, send me a fake one, I'll review it. All of those, learn as much as you can. And then when you sit down and you go through it with your client, you'll then know that if anything comes up, you'll simply say, if they have any questions, or there's something that you have a question about that they don't, you don't have to let them know. But if they have a question, you know the answer, say it's a great question. My understanding is this. However, before we submit anything, or before I send it to you for signatures, I'm going to double check on that to make sure I have the answer. There will always be situations where you're not going to have all the answers. And people don't want you to, they may want you to have all the answers, but that doesn't mean they want you to make up the answer if you don't. Not that you would do that. I know you wouldn't. I'm just saying, in general, don't analysis paralysis and be worried about going and talking to people about it because you don't know all the answers.
Okay.
and I say this, and I'm not just keep bringing up Karen because Deb's in here, but I do think I do think you guys are really good at that. I mean, when I get calls from Karen, I'll give them all the time. She's like, "This is the first time I've seen this." And honestly, we recently had one that was both of us were like, "How is this the first time we've seen this?" Right? It was the stove situation,
yeah.
and yeah, and it wasn't a fun one, right? But it was like we were
No.
like, "How have we both not seen this?" And we got answers. An answer that neither one of us liked, but we got the answers and we moved on from it. So
Yeah, and I would just add to Daniel, you know, I haven't been as licensed as long as Karen has, but in the 5 years that I have been selling real estate, I come to these every week that I possibly can, these gatherings here, because every time I learn something new, every single time. So I just love listening in and learning.
No, I've only been licensed for not even barely a month, and I'm, kind of, learn any of this in real estate school. So, I just wanted to make sure that I feel very on top of the main things that I don't want to miss. I didn't know if there's like a little packet somewhere or something you could look at, or.
I mean, like I said, I'd start with the basic ones. I mean, the only reason that I know them as quote well as I do is simply because I've just read them at an obnoxious number of times.
Yeah.
And that's, and even so, I mean, and if you ask anyone in the office, 9 times out of 10, if they call with a contract question, I'll have to say, hold on, let me pull it up and reread it as a reminder. In some situations I don't. Typically in things like the repair procedure, that one I pretty much gotten down, but there are some where you just got to reread it. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll obnoxiously read contracts.
do it. If you're ever if you're having trouble sleeping, just pick up one of the contracts and you'll get through. So, all right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll let you guys go. A couple minutes after 3. If you think of any, but after this, though, obviously shoot me an email, give me a call, and we'll go through them. All right. Thank you guys so much for being
Thank you,
here.
Joseph.
Have a good one.
Thanks again. Take care.